On this Tuesday night, urgent calls for calm and Canada's rail crisis to end. The Prime Minister in the line of fire.
We are extending our hands in good faith for dialogue.
Dialogue is not going to pay the bills for people who are facing layoffs.
And Andrew Scheer's speech that got him shut out of a leaders' meeting. China's unprecedented rules to contain COVID-19.
They don't want the virus to return to other places.
And concerns spreading in a Canadian city.
Terrified.
Plus, a discovery of astronomical proportions, the science redefining how planets were formed.
Global National with Donna Friesen. Reporting tonight, Robin Gill.
Good evening and thank you for joining us. We begin with breaking news. The rail blockade crisis is now having a direct impact on jobs. CN is temporarily laying off about 450 employees due to the protests that have crippled Canada's transportation network and the economy. The Prime Minister took heat in the House of Commons today over his handling of the situation. Justin Trudeau says he's committed to dialogue with Indigenous protesters, but says the solution will not be simple. The opposition says it's time the government stepped in and did something.
Mr. Speaker, dialogue is not going to pay the bills for people who are facing layoffs because of people breaking the law who have no connection to the Wetaskiwin First Nation.
We will exhaust every action possible to resolve this situation peacefully and rapidly.
The Assembly of First Nations is calling for calm, and tonight the House of Commons is holding an emergency debate over the crisis, sparked by support of the hereditary chiefs in BC opposed to a natural gas pipeline running through Wet'suwet'en territory. Via Rail is preparing to resume some passenger service in southwestern Ontario. But as Abigail Bimman reports in our top story tonight, the dispute is still far from over.
The rail blockade near Belleville, Ontario, still standing after nearly 2 weeks.
I know that people's patience is running short. We need to find a solution, and we need to find it now.
But the Prime Minister does not yet have one to offer, and the leader of the official opposition slammed him for that.
Standing between our country and prosperity is a small group of radical activists, many of whom have little to no connection to First Nations communities.
Yeah, I think what he said was so divisive that it rises to the level of racism.
The Prime Minister continues to call for peace and constructive dialogue. Ottawa has been offering a face-to-face meeting with some of the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs in BC.
This has to be at their invitation, as Minister Miller said, that there is not a lot of trust and there is an ongoing difficulty.
They told me they want to create their own approach to formalize discussions with the federal and provincial governments, the Crown. And they need to be given that time.
The National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations says there are options for a way forward that may ultimately bring down the blockades. But the Wet'suwet'en people need to be given respect and space to choose their own path.
There could be options like peacekeepers, like their own tribal police, but that can come from themselves.
One Grand Chief believes if the protests continue, they will become self-defeating. Serge Otsi-Simon says Indigenous people, too, will suffer from potential propane or food shortages.
Do we look at the rail blockades as having served its purpose for now? I'm simply pleading with the protesters that have you made your point yet? Has the government and the industry understood? I think they did.
But to show how divisive this issue is, for suggesting the blockade should end, Simon has been padlocked out of his own band council office, with calls for him to resign.
Abigail, the debate over the pipeline has sure spilled over into the political realm in Ottawa.
Well, Robin, Tuesday night MPs are holding an emergency debate called for by the NDP and the Bloc Québécois as an example of how divisive the politics are both among Indigenous people and here elected parliamentary politicians. This afternoon, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau held a meeting with opposition leaders, but he didn't invite the official opposition leader, Conservative Andrew Scheer. Trudeau's office said the Conservatives are only offering, quote, force and aggression as a solution. Scheer says the meeting was a distraction from Trudeau's inaction. Robin?
Abigail Bimman in Ottawa. You heard in Abigail's story one Grand Chief with a strong opinion on the ongoing blockades. He wants protesters to step aside. Here's more of his message to them.
The blockades doesn't mean that you surrender, like I said a while ago. It doesn't mean we're going to just lay down and let them kick us around. No. but it would show compassion along with the strength. Other people are suffering across the country because of this blockade. And not just non-Indigenous, the Indigenous people as well. Shortages in propane and probably food supplies are gonna start getting critical if this continues. So it will be a self-defeating purpose to continue on with the blockade. So I'm hoping that reason and peace are going to prevail, and that the message is going to continue on.
There was also a message today for the people calling for police intervention. One Grand Chief spoke about past mistakes and the need to learn from history.
To those people who are quick to pull the pin and to come down hard or demand that hard things, it's 30 years ago since what they call the Oka crisis. It's not that long ago with the Camp Ipperwash, and people you quote that and use that as a reminder to themselves. We should use restraint. Nobody wants to see that again.
You heard mention there of Oka and Ipperwash. Both are examples of the need for peaceful negotiation. Here's a reminder of what happened. Oka unfolded in 1990. The small village in Quebec became a flashpoint when the mayor announced plans for a golf course expansion and condo development project on disputed land that included a Mohawk burial ground. Protesters set up a blockade to stop construction crews, and for months they refused to budge. In July 1990, the mayor called in provincial police to tear down the blockade. That sparked chaos. Gunfire was reported from both sides, and a police corporal was shot and killed. Solidarity protests continued until Quebec called in the army in August. Protests ended in September, and the development project was eventually canceled, but the land has still not been transferred. 5 years after Oka, in 1995, another conflict over land unfolded, this time at Ipperwash Provincial Park in Ontario. At issue was the Stony Point Reserve, which the federal government took in the 1940s for use as a military camp. The Kettle and Stony Point First Nation repeatedly asked for the land back, but with little movement, they grew frustrated. In September 1995, protesters occupied Ipperwash Provincial Park. The Ontario Provincial Police were called in and violence unfolded. On September 6 of that year, Ojibwa protester Dudley George was killed. An inquiry later found significant problems with police and government response. In 2015, the First Nation accepted a $95 million settlement from the federal government, which included the land. The Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador is adamant his decision to resign has absolutely nothing to do with scandals inside his Liberal Party. Sources suggest Dwight Ball's performance has fractured the caucus and cabinet, but Ball says that's not the issue, and he just wants to spend more time with his family. Here's Ross Lord.
It's been less than a year since Dwight Ball's Liberals were re-elected with a minority government.
Welcome to the next chapter of a Liberal government in Newfoundland and Labrador!
No one expected the next chapter to end so soon, with Ball's sudden resignation.
It was all about, what was best for my family, and the fact that I just wasn't ready to run for another election. Not that I just wasn't ready, I just didn't want to.
Political observers wonder if Ball is moving away from his political family. They say members of the Provincial Liberal Caucus and others with connections to the party have been unhappy with his leadership.
For the most part, he was just a smiling suit. He was more about the brand. He was about gaining credit and avoiding blame. And part of that avoiding blame, I think, created all kinds of problems in his caucus.
Ball's 5 years in power have been marked by trouble, with scandals over patronage appointments and by finances. There were fears power rates would more than double to repay a massive cost overrun on the Muskrat Falls hydro project. He was even forced to explain his part in paying his daughter's bills after she became embroiled with a drug addict who was convicted of murder. But Ball insists he's not being pushed out by his own party, and he takes no blame for anything.
It's billions of dollars in problems that we inherited. When you look at a project like Muskrat Falls, it was billions of dollars that we inherited as well.
On the streets of St. John's, Ball's departure took some people by surprise.
Oh, I don't know what to think of it.
I guess he's got family commitments that are more important than running the province. So his own choice, I got to respect it.
Ball says the next Liberal leader will be chosen before the government tables its spring budget, which makes for a short leadership campaign. When it came to power, Ball became one of 7 Liberal premiers in Canada. Currently, his province and Nova Scotia are the only 2 controlled by Liberals. Ross Lohr, Global News, Halifax.
A former Canadian Forces reservist and accused neo-Nazi has pleaded not guilty to weapons charges in the U.S. Patrick Matthews was arrested by the FBI a month ago. The 27-year-old is facing charges linked to his role in an alleged plot to spark a race war in the U.S. Prosecutors allege Matthews videotaped himself advocating for killing people, poisoning water supplies, and derailing trains to incite a civil war. Matthews' attorney says he intends to argue that his First Amendment rights to free speech were violated. More passengers on that cruise ship in Japan are testing positive for COVID-19. Health officials report 88 new cases today, including at least 1 Canadian. A plane is on its way to bring home Canadians who so far haven't been infected. They've been under quarantine on the Diamond Princess for nearly 2 weeks. As Mike Armstrong explains, it was supposed to contain the spread, but may have done the opposite.
The Diamond Princess is being called a floating prison by passengers. It's being called something else by scientists, not a quarantine facility, but an incubator. About 10% of the ship is now contracted COVID-19. Something went wrong.
This is a highly transmissible virus, and that's one of the things that's of concern. You amplify that when you put it in a closed space.
Of the 3,700 people on the ship when the quarantine started, 542 have now tested positive. Among the latest, Montrealer Julien Bergeron. He's on the ship with his wife. Manon Trudel hasn't tested positive. They're going to be split up soon. Bergeron was supposed to be moved to a hospital. From the moment he leaves the room, Trudel says she has to restart 14 days of quarantine. Things are going from bad to worse. Healthy Canadians will be leaving the ship. The federal government says a repatriation flight is expected to leave Tokyo Thursday. Preparations are underway at the NAV Canada Centre in Cornwall, Ontario, where they'll be facing another 14-day quarantine. Fences are going up so they can get fresh air, but there's no contact with the public.
We're expecting about 250 people, but the number tends to fluctuate all the time.
Now, as was the case when Canadians were repatriated from China, everyone will be tested before they board the plane and when they arrive in Canada. Those first 2 flights were close to 400 people. None of them has tested positive. Despite that and repeated assurances from health officials,
I'm concerned. I have kids here,
there is some nervousness in Cornwall.
Terrified. I am talking to people.
The town's mayor says she spent 3 intense days telling the public there's no danger, but part of the apprehension, she says, maybe because the whole thing was sprung on her community without warning. Now, one thing the U.S. did that Canada isn't is bring back Diamond Princess passengers who tested positive. They brought back more than a dozen. Trudeau says the government should be bringing people like her husband home. They're desperate. She says the quarantine on the ship has been a failed improvisation, and she and her husband are starting to question whether they're going to get through this ordeal alive. Mike Armstrong, Global News, Montreal.
China is deploying a new strategy to stop the spread of COVID-19, and it involves dirty money. Global National is back in 2 minutes. In China, one of the doctors on the front line of the fight against COVID-19 has died. Liu Zhiming led the hospital at the epicenter of the outbreak in Wuhan. He mobilized resources as thousands of patients arrived each day. He's the 7th health worker to die of the disease. Over 1,700 medical personnel in China have been infected. The viral outbreak has now spread to more than 75,000 people globally. The death toll has hit a grim new milestone, rising to more than 2,000. The vast majority of these cases remain in China, and that's where new measures are being introduced to further restrict the movement of tens of millions of people. As Crystal Goomansingh reports, the World Health Organization is endorsing China's strategy.
Trapped at home, Wuhan is a city of more than 11 million people, but all of those individuals have nowhere to go, nothing to do, and it's about to get worse. The 76-year-old says as the virus continues to spread, control measures are becoming more stringent. People cannot easily get in or out of the neighborhoods. The streets of Shanghai are also bare despite being home to more than 24 million people. Students here have been instructed to work online. Never before has a government imposed so many restrictions on the movement of people. But China is one of the world's most populous countries, gripped by a virus no one had heard of until recently.
You can argue whether those measures are excessive. There's an awful lot at stake here in terms of public health and in terms of not only the public health of China, but of all people in the world.
While it appears the virus is most serious in individuals over 40 and those with pre-existing health conditions, little is known about it.
At the moment, we don't have enough data on cases outside China to make a meaningful comparison on the severity of disease or the case fatality rate. We're following up with countries to get more information about what happens about each case and the outcome.
Until there is hard data, different strategies are being tested. The right moves will only be determined after the outbreak is over. Crystal Goomansingh, Global News, London.
And China is taking more drastic steps to contain COVID-19, even if it means cleaning up its money. The country's central bank is destroying banknotes collected from markets, hospitals, and buses in regions most affected by the outbreak. New cash has been injected to make up for the supply since January, with 4 billion yuan worth of fresh notes already allocated to the city of Wuhan. COVID-19 is one of the reasons Air Canada is predicting a bleak first quarter. The company is warning earnings will be about $200 million lower than a year ago. Executives point to the suspension of flights to mainland China and the grounding of the 737 MAX aircraft. Air Canada has been backfilling the MAX jets with leased planes that have lower fuel economy and carry lighter loads. Still ahead, the aftermath of a terrifying crash at the Daytona 500.
You're watching Global National.
Here comes Hamlin up the outside. Wow. Crash into the wall, into the air. Goes Newman.
An update tonight on the condition of the driver in this high-speed and fiery crash during the last lap of Sunday's Daytona 500. Ryan Newman was leading when his race car slammed into the wall, launched into the air, and flipped several times. He's in serious condition in hospital. The doctors say his injuries are not life-threatening. Boy Scouts of America filed for bankruptcy today as it deals with numerous sex abuse lawsuits. Tens of thousands of men claim they were molested by Scout masters or other leaders decades ago. They only recently came forward because of changes to statute of limitations laws in a number of states. The bankruptcy puts those lawsuits on hold and gives the organization time to work on a compensation plan to settle those cases. In a statement, Boy Scouts of America says, quote, "At no time has the Boy Scouts knowingly allowed a perpetrator to work with youth, and we mandate that all leaders, volunteers, and staff members nationwide immediately report any abuse allegation to law enforcement." Donald Trump used his presidential power to grant pardons today. He pardoned Eddie DeBartolo, the former owner of the San Francisco 49ers, who was convicted in a gambling fraud case in Louisiana 22 years ago. He didn't serve time, but was fined $1 million. Trump also commuted the 14-year sentence of former Illinois Governor Rod Blagojevich, convicted of corruption in 2011, charges that included trying to sell then-President Barack Obama's vacated Senate seat. Today, Trump called the sentence ridiculous. Up next, solving the puzzle of our solar system's past. Scientists are getting a better understanding of the building blocks of our solar system tonight after studying the most distant object NASA has ever visited. Arrokoth is located in the Kuiper Belt, and as Eric Sorensen explains, it's helping find proof about how planets just like Earth were formed.
And liftoff. The New Horizons spacecraft left Earth 14 years ago.
Voyage to visit the planet Pluto
and then beyond.
It's the then beyond part that was almost an afterthought. The primary mission was to explore the dwarf planet Pluto, which happened with remarkable detail 5 years ago.
Who would have supposed that there were ice mountains?
But then New Horizons flew off deeper into space to explore the formation of planets, and lo and behold found Arakoth, just 35 kilometers long, with stunning evidence of how planets are formed.
It's just one small, lumpy object out at the far, far reaches of our solar system, out in the Kuiper Belt, but it's made a really, really big impact all across planetary science and astronomy.
We've long known about the major planets circling the sun. In terms of distance, tiny Arakoth is way out in the Kuiper Belt, a vast region of orbiting asteroids, comets, and icy objects. Arakoth is 6 billion kilometers from Earth, 44 times further from the sun than we are. The remarkable findings from New Horizons was that Arakoth was once two objects, and instead of a violent collision, they once orbited each other and came together at about this speed, 1 to 3 meters per second. They almost docked in space. Arakoth shows no fractures and craters that would have meant a forceful collision. Instead, it suggests planets may have begun from dust and small objects collapsing together gently, not violently.
Planets have been shaped by violent collisions, but how planets got started was always a mystery.
If it is a very violent a collision, how do things survive?
Elena Hyde says rusty-colored Arakoth's gentle formation may solve the puzzle.
This actually matches the simulation predictions for a more gentle collision. So this really changes how we understand planet formation.
Arakoth, a small object that represents a giant leap in our understanding of planets everywhere. Meantime, New Horizons has 10 to 20 years of power left and is now on its way deeper into the Kuiper Belt to learn more about the beginnings of our solar system. Eric Sorensen, Global News, Toronto.
And that is Global National for this Tuesday. I'm Robin Gill. Tonight, your candidate is Whitecourt, Alberta. We would love to see your part of this country, so email your pictures to viewers@globalnational.com. Thank you for watching. Donna Friesen will be back here tomorrow. Have a good night.